You're listening to The White Rabbit, conversations on the art of presenting in a rather noisy world. Your hosts are Matt Krause and Alper Rozanes. Matt helps leaders of international companies speak, write, and present with confidence. Alper is a communications trainer and a startup investor with a diverse portfolio of companies in Barcelona. If you like this podcast, please share it with friends and colleagues. Now, on to Matt and Alper for today's conversation. Matt, today I want to pick your brain on something that you mention a lot in trainings, and I like it, but I want you to go a little bit deeper on, and that is the four things in terms of presentations. What are they? Tell me.
Well, the four things, it's kind of like the initial filter. You know, when a client comes to me with a project, these are the first four things that I work on. And the reason that we start with these four things is that they're relatively simple and you get the biggest mileage. So, you know, like the Pareto 80-20 principle?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
These are the few things, I guess with to use the 80-20 numbers, these are the 20% of the things that'll get you the 80% of the improvement. So these are the few things that'll get you the most improvement.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah.
So what are they?
Well, the first one, and I'm not going to go into too much depth here because we've beaten it to death on this podcast. So we won't need to do it again today. Is to tell a story. To tell a story with your presentation. And one thing that I did want to mention about the telling a story is that one thing that I see often, it's kind of, I think of it as a micro story. You know, you can either, you can tell the macro story, which is, you know, boy meets girl or man in a hole or something like that with your overall presentation. That makes for a nice way to quickly sketch out an outline. But then there are often many opportunities within the presentation that to tell a micro story. And what I mean by micro story is that, for example, one thing that I'll see often is that, you know, I do work with technical engineering presentations, you know, whether it's a software engineer or, you know, a construction engineer or something like that. So kind of a technical presentation. And one of the underutilized, there's a diplomatic way to put it, the underutilized opportunities that I see is to tell a micro story will be in the photos, because often in the slide presentation, there will be a few photos, like, for example, photos of how a pole is attached to the ground. And it can be attached to the ground, you know, with bolts mechanically. It can be attached mechanically with bolts, or you can just put down a layer of glue, and there are advantages to each one. And that's an example of an underutilized opportunity, because you're showing these pictures, you're showing your audience these pictures of a pole, and they might not know. I mean, you know in your head why this picture of the pole is in there, but your audience doesn't know. And so you're missing this opportunity to tell them what's the story of this pole. What is this pole telling them about your USP? What is this story about? What is this pole telling? What story is this pole telling about the way that your company does business? So that's one thing. The first thing is tell a story. And the second thing is to reduce your all count. And the reason that I mentioned that is that, as we all know intellectually, it's much easier to listen to somebody who is not saying all the time. Like, for example, I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to the store. Option number one is I'm going to the store. And option number two is I'm going to the store. You know, which one of those two options is easier to listen to? And so
the second one, of course.
The second one, the one without all the ums. And the pushback that I often get, and it's an excellent pushback, is that the client will often say, well, I need the ums to think. I need that time to think, because often the client will be speaking, you know, English is not the client's first language, or it's not the first language of the audience. So nobody in the room, it's not the first language for anybody in the room. So the opportunity to think is extremely important. I mean, nobody wants an engineer who doesn't think. People like engineers who think. You know, if you're going to drive across a bridge, you want that bridge to be built by an engineer who thinks. So the argument, so the argument, I need time to think, that's a perfectly good argument. The thing is that when you are putting a bunch of these filler words, the ahs and the ums, into your speech, every time you say one, every time a sound comes out of your mouth, your audience members have to, even if it's just for a microsecond, their brain has to think for just a microsecond, is this a word? And if not, I can just discard it. And if I can discard it, it's not a word, so I can discard it. And now there's a hole, and I've got to go through the mental effort of connecting the words that came before it with the words that came after it. And now the audience is having to do a lot of mental work, and your audience is having to do twice as much work just to get the same point. If you said the exact same thing without the ahs and ums, then the audience would have to do half the work to get your message. And
That's good.
the next pushback that I get is usually, how do I do that? Which is also an excellent question. And I recommend, speaking of filler words, there's one for you. I recommend, I recommend becoming comfortable with silence. And
I like that.
it's hard to become comfortable with silence. It's not natural to become comfortable with silence. So the exercise that I'll start with is the client will utter any sentence. It could be anything. I am turning on the light, or I am shutting the door, or I am going to sleep now. Any example sentence. And then as part of the exercise, then you say that with spaces in between the words. Mm-hmm. So I am going to the store becomes I am. And nobody in the world is actually going to speak like that.
Of course.
But through the exercise, you become more used to the idea of putting silences in between your words. And with the fact that nobody's going to die if you do that. Nobody's going to die if there are silences between your words. In fact, they're probably going to love you for it, because it gives them time to think, which is what they need. And what your ahs and ums are robbing them of the opportunity to do. So that's the second thing, is to reduce your ah count.
I agree. One question before you move on to the third one.
Sure.
Why do you think we feel uncomfortable with silence? I mean, I have a theory, but it's more limited to maybe the Turkish culture where I grew up in. Because ask any ask any Turkish person probably whether they heard the words during primary school or elementary school or high school, when they were asked a question in front of everybody in the class, and when they couldn't answer, the teacher asked whether they swallowed their tongue in a way that would really, make them suffer at that moment. So we, as a culture, may be traumatized by that. I don't know if there are things like that in the US.
Oh, yeah.
But there are.
Well, maybe they're a little different, but the end point is the same, is that things are expected to be flowing out of your mouth. And if things aren't continuously flowing out of your mouth, you're stupid. And that's the baggage that people come away with, is that if I am not speaking at all moments,
it's pretty close.
I am dumb. And it takes a while to get over that baggage, because you have had decades to build that baggage into your way of thinking. So, and often that baggage can be stripped away in just a couple sessions, but it still takes a couple sessions. It's not, a one and done sort of thing, stripping away that baggage.
You're making a mini exposure therapy during the trainings about the silences.
Yeah, it's basically an amateur version of exposure therapy. Shall I move on to point number 3? Okay. Point number 3.
Yeah, before that, let's remember. Wait, the point number 1 was using a story structure.
Yeah, use a story structure.
The second one was
micro stories.
Reducing your filler word count.
And number 2, is reducing your filler word count. And so number 3 is make mirror neurons work for you. And, mirror neurons it's basically a fancy way of saying humans do what other humans around them are doing. If you are sitting across from somebody and your shoulders are facing them square on, it's highly likely that their shoulders are going to face you square on. If your foot is pointing at them, it's highly likely that eventually their foot is going to end up pointing at you.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, and one way that you can make this work for you is becoming less nervous, because if you're up there and you're nervous, then your audience is probably going to become nervous too. If you're scared of your audience, they're going to be scared of you. So whatever you want your audience to be feeling about you, you need to be giving off that air or giving off that vibe. And the first one, the most common one, of course, since this is giving a presentation or public speaking, is being nervous. So that's the first hurdle to overcome, is to not be nervous. And that's a very hard one to overcome. And actually, for a lot of reasons, it's completely unnatural for a public speaker to be not nervous. So it's completely natural to expect a public speaker to be nervous. But one way that you can reduce the effect of that is just by practicing a lot, practicing your presentation a lot, practicing your speech a lot, practicing way more than you think is necessary. And the result is that when it's time for you to get up and give it, your brain will not be occupied, 80% by thinking, okay, what am I going to say next? It'll be occupied, 10 or 20% by thinking about what am I going to say next. And so you're basically, by practicing a lot, you're reducing the brain space that you need for your presentation.
I see.
And that brain space, the excess or unused brain space, can just revert to the things that you've already been practicing all your life. I mean, you've been practicing all your life, like how to speak to your wife, your children, your friend, at the bar or whatever, and how to talk to people at a party, how to use your hands. These are skills that you've been practicing all your life. But if 80% of your brain is occupied just by remembering the things that you've got to say next, then there's very little room for that stuff. So that's why we practice a lot, is to make room for that stuff. That's the third thing.
Okay, that sounds good.
And the fourth thing is to use vivid language. And this is very, very rarely something that the client can do or even lead. It kind of requires an outside person to do. And so what we do is we'll take what I call a baseline, which is the client delivering the presentation. And so now I'm talking a little bit about my work process. We'll take a recording of the client giving the presentation, and then I'll get a transcript of that client giving a presentation using whatever tool. I have a gazillion tools that I use to make transcripts. So I'll get a transcript, and then I'll go through that transcript, and I'll do what I call combing or cleaning. And I'll go through that transcript and I'll say, okay, well, here's a word, and a more vivid way to say that is XYZ. And the reason we do that is that if you get up there and you give your speech or your presentation and you use dead or uncolorful words, then 5 minutes later, or when your audience leaves the room, they're going to forget what you said. They're going to forget you. And when you're doing a pitch presentation, that's not the effect you want.
That's the last thing you want.
Yeah, you don't want them to forget you. Whereas if you use vivid words, then those vivid words will rattle around inside the heads of the people who are in your audience. And even after you have disappeared off the stage, even after they don't see you anymore, they'll still be thinking about those vivid words. And let me give you a quick example of how that would look. Let's talk about a door. The door closed quickly. That's the unvivid way of saying, or that's the plain way of saying it. The door closed quickly. If you comb through that sentence again, you might say the door slammed shut. And when you use that phrase, slammed shut, then people can imagine like the sound of the door slamming. Yeah, the sound. There's the sound of the door slamming shut. There's the rush of air of the door slamming shut. There's maybe some anger behind somebody who pushed the door shut, slammed the door shut quickly. So there's some images, there's some sounds, there's some emotions involved, and none of those things were involved in the previous sentence. And so when your audience leaves, or when you leave the stage, those emotions or those images or those feelings or those sounds are going to remain, or are more likely to remain in the audience's heads. So those are the four things that I
like that.
The four initial filters: telling a story, reducing the count.
To recap,
putting mirror neurons to work for you. In other words, practicing a lot, and then using vivid vocabulary or vivid language. Those four things.
Great. And you use these in almost every client interaction that you have in the training, right?
Yeah, pretty much every single client. 100% of the clients are going to be run through this filter. How are they doing on these four things?
Okay, that's great. Well, Thank you very much for sharing those tips and the content.
You're welcome. My pleasure. So I will talk to you next week then.
Yes, take care.
All right,
Goodbye.
bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to The White Rabbit with Matt Krause and Alper Rozanes. You can subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or through your favorite feed.